Hi, I'm Finn, and this is a mixed introduction and Q&A for my SpecEvo project because I'm currently out of the country for a course in my master's program and haven't had enough free time to dedicate to the project. This video was supposed to come out last week, but walking around ancient ruins and archaeological sites in 100-degree heat takes a lot out of a guy. The audio quality varies because I answered these questions over the course of a week and a half in various places, as I didn't want to pester my roommates with me narrating under the blanket while they tried to sleep. But I'll be back in the States in about 10 days when I hope to buy a mic and be able to record in my own room, and not in an ancient Odeon next to a playground, which is a very surreal thing that I can now say I've done. Dragons of the Cenozoic follows the history of a world where the non-avian dinosaurs didn't go extinct from the KPG event. The project doesn't have as massive a scope as if it were asking, what if the KPG event never happened? Just, what if a handful of non-avian dinosaurs survived into the Cenozoic? The extinction event 66 million years ago still occurred on schedule, leading to the extinction of most animals more than 25 kilos and many animals under that weight. But instead of 100% of the non-avian dinosaurs meeting their end, 3 species from 3 different clades managed to stagger into the Paleocene. You've met these 3 by now: the basal thyreophorine Eoaspasaurus, the elasmarian Omicadromius, and the Rohan avian Antarctolestes. I'm being intentionally vague by calling Antarctolestes a Rohan avian because there's still a lot of debate over what exactly Rohan avis even was, with some saying it's a unlogine dromaeosaur, some saying it's a sister clade to Aviella, and some saying that it is part of Aviella. Dragons in the Cenozoic in its current form is much more subdued than some of the earlier ideas I had as a SpecEvo setting. The earliest iteration of the concept has had barely anything to do with the current version, other than that it was focused around surviving dinosaurs. The first version was a heavily pulp-influenced, but still slightly more realistic version of the idea presented in S.M. Stirling's The Sky People and The Court of the Crimson Kings, where Mars and Venus had been terraformed by ancient aliens and made into seed worlds using Earth life from a wide variety of different eras. In Stirling's book, the animals and plants taken from the Earth are still the same as when they were first plopped onto Mars and Venus, which is how you got Neanderthals with AK-47s doing battles with Triceratops in the jungles of Venus. In my idea, evolution wouldn't have stood still on Mars and Venus, called Demeter and Hestia by the Earthlings of that timeline. I dreamed of telling the story in a sort of podcast format where competing Soviet and American scientific expeditions in the 70s and 80s would send audio journals of their expeditions' findings back to Earth. That version of the project never got out of the planning phase, as I quickly realized that it was kind of overwhelming in scope. That ultimately gave way to the idea of Eocene South America, and then Antarctica and Australia being a kind of seed world accident. What would happen is that early Jurassic fauna would be deposited on the planet when it was meaning to update its Earth flora and fauna. This version got substantially further into development, with me writing several blog entries and commissioning an artist just for some of my creature designs, before I ultimately decided I wanted to cut out the sci-fi aspects altogether and try something more grounded, which is how I ended up starting work on the initial concept of Dragons of the Cenozoic, where Antarctolestes was the only surviving non-avian dinosaur, before eventually deciding to incorporate Eoaspasaurus and Omicadromius. Let's get into some of the questions and comments that I have from you guys. Will the dinosaurs spread around the world? Yes, but also no. There will be natural dispersal from Antarctica into South America and Australia during the early Paleocene, just as marsupials traveled to Australia from South America and into North America during the Gavi. But just as no South American mammals managed to cross Beringia into Asia and no marsupials managed to cross the Wallace Line, no non-avian dinosaurs will make it into Eurasia and Africa until well into the Holocene, where transatlantic and transpacific trade will cause a floral and faunal interchange along the lines of the Columbian Exchange. Was there any chance of pterosauria surviving the KPG extinction? Also, is it possible for descendants of this bipedal thyreophorian survivor to eventually become quadrupedal once again? I'm going to give a yes and no answer for that first question. Yes, I think it's possible that things could have played out slightly differently, and a small nyctosaur or a basal tapejarid could have survived the KPG event. While I leaned into Antarctolestes not being arboreal as being a strong factor in its survival and a large reason for the extinction of the Anantiornithian birds, a 2021 paper by Jonathan J. Hughes and Jacob S. Berv provides some evidence that arboreality may not have been the death sentence that some assumed it to be. Decanolestes was arboreal and was one of the only known Indian mammals to have survived the KPG, and stem primates like Purgatorius may have already emerged as arboreal animals prior to the extinction event. So, with a little bit of luck a small basal tapejarid that has a generalist diet of fruits, seeds, and small vertebrates and insects could theoretically have survived the extinction and then radiated into a whole host of new forms in the Cenozoic. Their survival would have had a massive global impact because they would quickly recolonize the world from their refugium and become some of the largest predators on the planet. A tapejarid the size of Hatzegopteryx would be a top-order carnivore in nearly every ecosystem, and after the rise of grasslands and savannas in the Miocene, they would be a near omnipresent threat. They could dramatically alter the course of evolution for everything from horses to hominids, and there lies the no of my answer. Same goes for enantiornithian birds, which would have been able to become significantly larger terrestrial animals because of their longer rod-shaped pygostyle, while being able to achieve global distribution with their better flight abilities. So, could pterosaurs have survived if they had had a slightly better hand dealt to them? Sure. But was there any chance that I was going to include them? No. At least not in the main project. I do plan on doing a 2-part AU that is a concise history of post-KPG nyctosaurs and tapejarids, but incorporating them into the main project would mean having to branch out into the rest of the world far earlier and to a far greater degree than I'm prepared to do. If you're interested in a short Spec Evo project about surviving pterosaurs, the author of the excellent Multituberculate Earth has a brief AU where nyctosaurs instead of birds survive the KPG. I'll post a link in the comments for everyone interested to take a look at it. If you haven't checked out Multituberculate Earth itself, I highly recommend it, and its exploration of a world where placental mammals went extinct while multis survived and thrived. As for your second question, yes, some of Eospathosaurus' descendants will give rise to several quadrupedal clades as they get larger and diversify. Don't expect an ankylosaur-sized animal in the next video, but it really can't be overstated just how rapidly animals grew in size and diversity after the KPG. Just a few 100,000 years into the Danian, you were already seeing placental mammals the size of sheep, like Ectoconus, and within 3 million years, you were getting carnivores the size of black bears. I don't want to fast forward to charismatic species like megatheropods and ornithopods the size of Shantungosaurus, but I really do want to try and capture the rapid radiation of species that occurred in the wake of the KPG. How big do the post-KPG theropods get? If they never achieved giant size like their ancestors, then what was the limiting factor in their size? Lack of prey or anatomical reasons? The Miocene and Pleistocene are still very far away, and things are bound to change between me writing vague ideas about theropod size now and me actually fleshing things out in the future. But I'm leaning towards the Miocene giant Gigacarnifex topping out at about 4 tons, and the Pleistocene giant Elaphavonator reaching a similar weight. These animals are substantially larger than the largest Cenozoic carnivores of our world, but are substantially lighter than either of the Mesozoic giants Tyrannosaurus or Giganotosaurus. Or Giganotosaurus, if you prefer. The answer is largely anatomically driven. because of how atrophied the caudal femoralis in paraavians is and how front-heavy they would be when they get larger. This is offset to a degree by longer tails and the evolution of a Carcharodontosaurid-like fatty muscular hump behind the hip to recenter their weight, similar to Concavenator, and what might have been on Meraxes. Big asterisk on might. In earlier iterations of the project, when Antarctolestes was the only survivor and didn't radiate into any herbivorous niches, I was planning on Gigacarnifex maxing out at about the size of Allosaurus fragilis because of the limitations of hunting large K-reproduction strategist mammals like the giant Australopithecines and Toxodons, which would not have had the animal size or reproduction rates necessary to support truly massive megatheropods. I was explaining this to someone online, and they said, wouldn't a generalist omnivore have radiated into herbivory as well? And I had an actual facepalm moment because of how dumb I felt. So the prey restriction isn't there, as there will be multiple lineages of multi-ton herbivorous dinosaurs roaming South America and Australia. Were there any Alvarezsaurids who were generalist insectivores? If they were, they would have had a higher chance of survival. And also, how would a featherless theoretical thyreophorans survive the impact cold? The Patagononychines probably represent a population that is too specialized to have made it through, though something more basal might have had a more generalist diet that could have helped them make it through. I don't think I'm going to revise things to have them survive into the Paleocene, but I'm not totally opposed to the idea. As for how the featherless thyreophoran survived the winter, that would be because it was semi-fossorial and because it wasn't totally featherless. I probably could have drawn some whisker-like lines on Eoaspasaurus and highlighted the fact that it was feathered to a degree in my narration. But since feathers are probably basal to Dinosauria, I kind of just assumed all dinosaurs, especially all small dinosaurs, have some feathering to a degree. Certainly not to the same degree as Antarctolestes or our little Elasmerian Omegadromius, but to some degree. So Eoaspasaurus had a bit of fuzz to help it out while it roosted underground during the harshest parts of the impact winter. Are you planning on marine reptiles surviving? I got several people asking about marine reptiles, and like with pterosaurs, I plan on doing a 2-part AU video that focuses on the survival of freshwater mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, maybe even a hybodont shark or two. Like with pterosaurs, part of this is because dealing with the rapid global distribution of marine reptiles as they recolonize the planet is a daunting task, and almost certainly would butterfly whales out of existence, only for most of the giant marine reptiles to get obliterated by the Grand Couperet event at the end of the Eocene, if they haven't already been dealt a death blow by the Middle Eocene cooling. The other part that is keeping them as a brief AU is that while I think that they might have gotten luckier and things had played out just a little bit differently, I rank them as being significantly less likely to have been able to survive the KPG event than small generalist dinosaurs and small pterosaurs. Unlike crocodilians, mosasaurs were very likely to be endotherms, and the same goes for plesiosaurs, which puts them at a distinct disadvantage compared to crocodilians when it comes to surviving on an incredibly reduced amount of prey. If we create a speculative species that is close to the same conservative size estimates of Cladastes, one of the mosasaurs we know lived at least part of its life in freshwater conditions, that's still a 2-meter-long endothermic carnivore with all the metabolic requirements that entails. If we go even smaller and say the survivor is some sort of basal mosasaur about the same size of Dallosaurus, and ignore the oddness of it appearing 20 million years later on the other side of the world, you still have to deal with the fact it's an obligate carnivore with a relatively high metabolic rate. It gets even worse for plesiosaurs. Let's say it's a freshwater polycotylid that's a full meter smaller than the smallest plesiosaur ever to live. It's still going to struggle to survive through the KPG the way crocodilians and champsosaurs were able to. These large marine reptiles, even when they aren't so large, are just too specialized for their own good. So one question I had several people ask was if the dinosaurs would make it to the modern day. The Holocene is 66 million years away from where we're currently at, 100 years removed from the KPG, so there's a lot of time for things to change. But I do plan on having dinosaurs survive to the modern day. Will Mexica warriors ride into battle on the backs of 6-ton theropods while conquistadors bring back eggs of 16-ton ornithopods as gifts, accidentally causing an ecological disaster as they rapidly reproduce and spread on a continent without any natural predators? No, probably not. But will North and South America and Australia be more ecologically diverse and retain a larger cast of megafauna than they did in our Holocene? Almost certainly. Are there going to be surviving non-avian theropods outside of Antarctica and southern Australia in this series? If you mean, will there be descendants of Antarctolestes spreading to South America and North America, the answer is yes. If you mean, are there other non-avian theropods on other continents, the answer is no. It would be kind of neat to have Rahan avis and Simosuchus survive in Madagascar and have their own radiations on the island, so I might do a one-off AU video about their survival and radiation until their ultimate extinction, along with 50% of all other Paleocene and Eocene terrestrial vertebrates in Madagascar during the Grand Coubre, but I really don't want to disrupt the Eurasian landmass. Are we going to see humans domesticate the surviving non-avian dinosaurs as pets and livestock in this alternate timeline? Don't expect domesticated theropods larger than a dog or anything like that, because the cost requirements for feeding such a massive animal would be too prohibitive for most pre-industrial peoples to support. But I absolutely foresee some level of domesticated dinosaurs. This next question is a two-parter, with the first part wondering about surviving dinosaurs in the Northern Hemisphere. I might do a one-off or two-part video covering an AU where a smolta, scalosaur, and troodontid survive in the Northern Hemisphere, maybe a leptoceratopsid surviving in Asia, similar to my plans for the topogarids and plesiosaurs. But because of reading James Gurney's Dinotopia and S.M. Sterling's The Sky People as a kid, I've always wanted to do a project where dinosaurs and humans cohabitate. So that was one of my primary motives when I first started planning the project a few years ago. And well, dinosaurs in Eurasia and Africa would be a bit disruptive to human evolution, to say the least. The next part of the question is about the mass extinction during the Middle Miocene in South America that absolutely decimated its local megafauna, and whether I plan to ignore it to maintain a robust cast of fauna in South America. I unfortunately don't think the localized mass extinction can be avoided, only slightly minimized. The collapse of the Amazon Lake network, the rise of the Andes, and the possibility that a substantial comet struck Patagonia are all going to be very disruptive to life in South America. To stop the South American Miocene mass extinction would require halting the rise of the Andes, keeping the Isthmus of Panama from forming, and possibly stopping a comet from impacting, though that one is still controversial. Even though it's millions of years from where we are now, I already have visions of the last of the giant Giga Carnifexes failing her final hunt on the Pampas as a small ornithopod successfully evades her jaws in the expanding grasslands. That being said, I'd love to see a Spec Evo project about that premise. It and what if Antarctica moved north, preventing the creation of permanent glaciers on the South Pole, are two Cenozoic-era Spec Evo questions that I would love to see delved into deeper by someone. However, that doesn't mean that everything is doom and gloom. Large herbivorous reproductive strategists will be in a significantly better position to bounce back than the large mammals of our timeline. And with them being able to weather the change better, their predators will be able to weather the change as well. Dinosaurs, even when applying avian metabolic rates, and not a mix of avian and crocodilian, have a significantly lower metabolic requirement than considerably smaller mammals, meaning that while population numbers may crash, large herbivores will likely be able to sustain themselves better than mammals, even as grasslands advance. In addition to probably being able to better weather the ecological and climate shifts, any potential megatheropod that makes it into North America prior to the Gabi, similar to terror birds and sloths, will be entering an ecosystem where their niche does not exist, where the decline of the open forests will be less of an issue than it was for terror birds, because they will be hunting animals well outside of what was possible for North America's predator kill. While the Machaerodonts absolutely hunted juvenile proboscideans and likely opportunistically hunted adolescent and lone adult proboscideans, just like modern lions do, they wouldn't be filling the same niche as a 4-ton theropod that had previously been hunting large ornithopods, with lungs that are far better than those of mammals for endurance flight. This next question asks about the cebechids and the forest rockids, two of South America's iconic archosaurian predators from our world. Cebechids will be playing a large role in the project for all of the Paleogene and a good amount of the Neogene. Because of their weight advantage over similarly sized theropods, they will be among the dominant top-order carnivores of South America, with the possibility of 3 to 4 ton Physalusuchus-sized cebechids reigning over the continent, while smaller dromaeosaur-like theropods exist as vassal predators to the giant land crocs. In some ways, Paleogene South America will be a bit more like the Triassic than the rest of the Mesozoic, since dinosaurs will be the dominant large herbivores, but there will still be an abundance of medium-sized therapsids competing with them, and giant pseudotsuchians hunting them. The forest rockids are honestly something I'm struggling with. The earliest undisputed forest rockid is an Eocene African genus, which some have taken as evidence that the forest rockids are an immigrant taxon to South America. But last year's paper, Eocene Cariamiforms from Antarctica, showed that by the Ypresian, there were 100-kilo forest rockids in Antarctica, which suggests that the African and European forest rockids may have independently developed flightlessness from still flighted forest rockids, similar to what happened with the paleognaths. However, even the most liberal interpretation would place the emergence of the Carianiforms around 60 million years ago, or possibly several million years after the first non-avian theropod starts to filter north from the Weddellian Isthmus into South America. And they may well be snuff out the basal forest rockids because of Gase's competitive exclusion principle. So maybe the forest rockids go extinct very early. I'm not really sure. Next is a great question by Atriox about diversification and endemism in dinosaurs once Antarctica starts to glaciate. The Australian and South American clades are probably going to start diverging considerably sooner than the mid-Eocene cooling period, and way before the first full-time glaciers appear in Antarctica. Australodelphia's divergence from South American marsupials in the Paleocene probably means that there was a single dispersal event in the early Paleocene when it was still possible to traverse all of Antarctica. But as the Paleocene continued, fauna from South America, which was able to travel to West Antarctica, became unable to continue eastwards, likely because there was a rift that ended up connecting the Weddell Sea and the Ross Sea, essentially cutting the continent in half. This is why you don't get nodal ungulates, terror birds, and other Eocene and late Paleocene South American fauna in Antarctica, even though Antarctica was connected to both continents. It's just Antarctica wasn't connected to itself. The next part is about how Australia will be a continent that, at least superficially, will be mostly unchanged in its cast of characters from the Mesozoic, because unlike South America, it won't have a huge influx of placental herbivores to deal with at the dawn of the Paleocene, and then a full-blown interchange in the later Cenozoic. And this is all superficial, because Therian marsupials did not exist in Mesozoic Australia. They're an artifact of the Cenozoic. I can very much see Australia being characterized by Europeans as a continent stuck in time, especially by Victorian-era biologists and paleontologists. Though Dinosauria as a name certainly won't exist, since Europeans would have long since encountered living taxa of animals they will come to know as Dracoaves. It isn't hard to imagine a Richard Owen-type character claiming that his megalosaur and iguanodon are the ancestors of the American and Australian taxa, with the Australian taxa representing an older lineage untouched by the rise of placental mammals. As for human settlement of Australia, I tend to think that human settlement won't be stalled into the 18th century, or anywhere near that. But I do think that Aboriginal societies that form will be fairly different as a result of their interactions with the dinosaurs. The next question is about possible competitors and dangers to these early Paleocene survivors. Unfortunately, while it's pretty easy to find information about Maastrichtian Antarctica and Eocene Antarctica, gathering information on terrestrial fossils from the Sobral Formation is about as difficult as pulling teeth, especially if you're someone whose university has dramatically cut back the academic journals it pays for students to be able to access. Very cool. The 3 papers I have been able to access have discussed bivalves and benthic foraminifera, but a discussion of terrestrial taxa present through the KPG or appearing immediately after is tough to come across. The formation prior to it has information on several flightless birds that might have competed with Antarctolestes for near-shore foraging, but because they lacked flight, they were unable to easily migrate from areas that couldn't support them after the impact, while Antarctolestes, even with its more limited flight capabilities, could. For small mammals, the record gets spotty up until the Eocene. That being said, it's probable that, at least in the western part of Antarctica, non-therian mammals like the Gondwanatheres, the Meridiolestids, and monotremes were all present alongside the dinosaurs from the very beginning of the Paleocene. Unlike the therian Meridiungulates and Sparassodonts, which are kind of an immigrant group. These non-therian mammals are kind of famous for losing to their therian rivals, or at least their northern cousins, the multituberculates, are. But maybe things won't turn out that way this time around. After all, the Meridiolestid Peligrotherium was already the size of a dog 5 million years after the KPG. The surviving dinosaurs aren't really big enough to suppress mammal evolution in Antarctica the way that they were able to do to our ancestors in the late Triassic. Maybe South America's mammal cast will be stranger than the world we know. Maybe shrew-sized insect-eating Meridiolestids will give rise to fox-sized nest raiders, which will in turn give birth to bear-sized brawlers, using their bulk to try and intimidate smaller theropods away from kills in the temperate polar forests of Paleocene Antarctica. Maybe cow-sized Gondwanatheres will claim the title of the largest Alatherian from Taniolabus. Maybe the dinosaurs aren't the only group given a second lease on life. And the final question/comment. Your ideas inspired me to do my own version, which starts with a small dromaeosaur, 2 species of Parksosaur, a Thescelosaur, and a basal ceratopsian, as well as a species of Maniraptoran. And I've got to say, awesome. I can't tell you how cool it is to know that I helped inspire someone to be creative and to explore a SpecEvo project of their own. I would not be making this if it weren't for things like the Sky People, the Speculative Dinosaur Project, and Dr. Polaris's excellent Ultra Earth series. RIP that series. So knowing that I had a similar effect really brings a smile to my face. Alrighty, it was great reading your comments and answering your questions. Hopefully I will have a video for you next week, though it might be a little on the shorter side because walking around 100-degree heat doesn't leave one with a lot of energy to draw or even really think about writing a script. But if I can't get you a video out next week, then I'll absolutely, maybe, get you one the week after next. Alrighty, thank you all for watching and liking and subscribing. It's great talking to you, and I will hopefully talk to you next week.